Welcome to the Power of Love show sponsored by the TJ Jackson Foundation, where we shine a light on loss and grief and how it impacts our lives. We are here to provide hope, resources, and a community so no one feels alone in their grief. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Power of Love show sponsored by the TJ Jackson Foundation, where we shine a light on loss and grief and how it impacts our lives. I am TJ Jackson, and with me is my eldest brother, Taj Jackson.
What's up, T?
What is going on, Taj?
Mhm.
Um, Nothing much. Taj has a busy week because he has several birthdays within his immediate family. So Taj is on planning mode, I'm sure. Uh,
Planning mode is a nice way of putting it. Yes, planning mode.
well, anyways, to everyone who's joined us, we of course are live on the Power of Love show. You may be watching us on Facebook or YouTube. And if you are not with us live, you're probably listening to us via podcasts. Yes, that is correct. Our show is also uploaded every single week to every single podcast major platform. So if you are a podcast listener, make sure to check us out there.
Hmm.
Subscribe to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, make sure to leave a review. It helps others who may be looking for the content find it. We are not licensed therapists. We are just ordinary people who have experienced loss in our lives. We've been impacted by it, and we have learned from it. And we like to do this show in an attempt to share our opinions and how we were able to get through any type of loss or struggles we've been through in our lives.
Hmm.
Saying that, if you need professional help, we urge you to seek it and to find it. Please do not just rely on us.
Yes.
Um, Taj Jackson, we did not do a show last week, if I
No, we didn't.
remember correctly. So it's been a couple of weeks. I don't think we've done a show since Thriller Night.
Hmm.
So I would love to just, instead of talking about each other's weeks, we could just talk a bit about Thriller Night so then we can get on with our wonderful planned show with our wonderful guests. So,
Correct.
Mr. Jackson, well, what's your thoughts? And you want to talk about Thriller Nights at all?
Yeah, I mean, look, so basically, for those that don't know, um, us in Hill, Los Angeles, um, we put on this Halloween party called Thriller Nights, and it was Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Friday and Saturday were for adults, and Sunday, which was probably the best day, is for kids, basically inner city kids and kids that we bring to Havenhurst um, to enjoy a Halloween kind of party, and it's fun watching them run around and just because they know everything's free and they're free and they just seeing the smiles on their face was everything.
Yeah.
It always is though. It's always the most rewarding part of that crazy weekend, in general. But yeah, yeah,
I will say this, it's an amazing weekend. It's all for good cause, as you mentioned, for Hill LA as well as the DD Jackson Foundation. But it's Sunday that's my favorite day because, like you
yep,
said, the kids are so happy. They're so, they feel like it's like Disneyland, but without having to ask permission to get things because everything's free for them.
everything's free.
So it's really cool. But what was also special to me was being able to meet everyone. I should say everyone, but we got to meet a lot of
Yeah, we got to meet
wonderful,
a lot of
a
people, right?
lot of familiar names and some wonderful faces for the very first time, so that, and people came all over the world to support the foundations and to be a part of the event. So it was really, really, really cool to see everyone.
And we see a lot of familiar faces. We're talking about the DDJF community. We got to,
Yeah.
yeah, we got to meet a lot of people
Um,
for the
Ca-
first time.
Carrie says it looked like a blast. Carrie, it was a blast. It was
Yes,
a lot of fun.
a lot of fun, a lot of work, but a lot of fun.
Todd, I have to say, this weekend, I mean, we've had a lot of wonderful Thriller Night weekends, but I think this one was one of my favorites. It was really cool, seeing Sister Sledge up there, or Kathy Sledge, and just all the other talent that performed, and
Yeah,
it just seemed really cool. It just seemed a lot of fun.
yeah,
So
right. Yeah,
big,
there's a lot of awesome artists and stuff that lent to it, and it was an amazing night. I mean, it's just there's a lot of people, so it was very surreal in terms of meeting everyone, but it was also
Mhm.
really great. But you kind of have to pace yourself too because you have many nights of it. So it was a lot of fun. I had a lot of pre-planning though, as you know, ahead of time, and and
Yeah.
John and Prince from Hill, Los Angeles did an amazing job.
Yeah. It's a lot of work that goes into it, but it's all worth it in the end. Um, well, Taj, anything else you want to share before we invite our guest on and we have an important discussion with her?
No, not really, TJ. I'm just,
Okay.
I'm chilling here. I'm going to be in chill mode for this
Uh,
one. I'm excited to hear what our guest has to say, and you know, I'll chime in when needed, like I always do.
Very, very cool, Taj. And before we get on to that, I do want to give a shout out to Lala Chan Network for the $10 super chat on YouTube, who says, sending love and support, much love. Thank you so much, Lala Chan. Of course, you guys can spread the word about DDJF on your social media.
Yes.
But if you do want to contribute and help us, you can go either to www.ddjf.org. You can even buy through Amazon using our Smile. I don't know the technical term, but Amazon has a really cool thing where they allow foundations
Mhm.
to your purchases to contribute to foundations at no extra charge to you. So look into that. And then, of course, you can also do a super chat on YouTube that also comes to us. So thank you all so much for that support.
Yeah, especially since Black Friday's coming soon.
Oh, good point.
Yeah,
Good
so we're
point.
gonna have to really think about that Amazon Smile thing because that's a good way to contribute to the Judy Jackson Foundation with just buying stuff on Amazon, which I know everyone does anyway.
Great, great point.
Right? Amazon Smile.
Um, all right, Taj, let's get on to it, man. So
Do it.
on today's episode of the Power of Love show, we have a very special guest. Her name is Leanne Friesen. And Leanne Friesen is the founder and facilitator of the Instagram page Grieving Room, which
Mm.
has grown to over 20,000 users in just 1 year. She's
Wow.
also the author of the forthcoming book, Grieving Room, which will be released in 2024. Leanne is a fellow griever who became particularly passionate about grief education after the death of her sister in 2013. Additionally, she is an ordained minister who regularly officiates funerals and supports grieving people. Leanne believes that grief does not need to be minimized, avoided, or fixed. Instead, we need to give it room. Very cool. Here today to discuss her work, the online community she has cultivated, and her highly anticipated forthcoming book. Without much further ado, please welcome everyone, Leanne Friesen, to the Power of Love show. Leanne, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me
So good to
and the
see
kind
you.
introduction.
I love giving room. That's such a cool concept. So we're gonna get into
Yeah,
all of that.
yeah.
But first, as I like to start the questioning with, is what inspired you to focus part of your life's work in the grief space? I would love to hear it from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us probably that have tuned in today, and like you, certainly a huge shift happened after my sister died. Before that, as you mentioned, I work in an industry. Industry is maybe not a great word, but in my career, I do a lot of work with grieving people. So I officiate funerals. And even looking back, I've always been, interestingly enough, pretty interested in grief. Like I remember in my undergrad doing as an elective a course on death, just like to fill a slot, because I was interested in this idea of how we process grief as a culture and understand death and so on. And so even as I was training to work in ministry, to work in a church, I was doing a lot of courses in grief, a lot of courses in grief support and counseling. So that had always been a big part of what I'd done. I was very passionate about making sure people could grieve well, that they had room to lament. And then I had this interesting dynamic of then going through grief myself in a deep way. I'd lost other loved ones. I'd grieved grandparents and friends. But this loss of my sister really just brought to light how difficult our culture finds it to let people grieve, and how I just sort of felt like I was wandering around desperately wanting to find some space to talk about my sister, to talk about my grief, to talk about what I was really going through. And it was just like I felt like I was on the outside looking in all the time. And I was just perpetually frustrated that it just felt like, there's no room for my grief. There's no space. No one seems to know what to do with this. I felt like I was often trying to help other people know how to support me. And so I became more and more passionate about, as I was healing more and more and learning to process my own grief, I really became so concerned with making that space for others to say, I went through this and I knew what I didn't have or what I needed or what I learned. And maybe I can help you think about what that means for you.
Mm.
And so that was really step by step how this evolved and went little by little, that I became sort of like the grief person. I joke that grief is my weird hobby, that I
Mhm.
sort of do it as a I just seek to support grievers as a pastime, but that's really the case for me.
Your Instagram page at grieving.room
Mhm.
contains obviously a wealth of helpful grief related content and has garnered over 20,000 followers in just 1
Yeah,
year
it grew
since its
quick.
launch. That
Yeah.
is amazing. That
Yeah.
is special. That's really cool. Couple of questions regarding that. What was the motivation behind starting the Instagram page and what was your mission in doing so?
When I've always been interested in writing, and so I had written this book, which was in the process of kind of floating around. I knew it would be a long time before that really got out there in terms of the publishing process. It's still a year away. When I was writing in years past, I often wrote about grief. I have a blog. I haven't kept up in it in a little while, but
Mhm.
I would write a lot about grief on my Facebook page, my public writing page, on my blog. And I always loved those posts, and they would have a lot of traction, a lot of interest. And it was for ages, I kept thinking to myself, I just need to do a separate page where I can just focus on grief and just share the things that I feel would be helpful for others. And
Yeah.
finally, one day I said, I just have to start this. This is just so on my mind and on my heart to make that space and share really simple truths. I think grief education is so lacking
Yeah.
in general. And so there's a general sense that even things that after you grieve for a while or when you're in the grieving community, and I have a certificate in death and bereavement, and I'm almost, and so even with all the training that I've had and things that begin to almost seem like everyone should know this, everyone should understand this, isn't this obvious? But it's not, and it's
Mhm.
not when you're grieving, and people need someone to say it, and they need someone to remind them. So I remember the first post that really took off, and you have a social media sort of presence. I was just sort of faithfully once or twice a week sharing a few thoughts. And I did a post that said, of course you're tired, you're grieving. And it just had a little reflection about how when you're grieving, you're really, really tired. And
Yeah.
suddenly I think I got like 5,000 followers in a few days as people reshared this idea, this really simple idea that when you're grieving, you're tired
Yeah.
and it makes you tired. And so many people saying, I never realized that before. I didn't realize that's what my grief was causing that. And so bit by bit, those little things just kept growing and growing. So I just do the same thing. I try to post once or twice a week and share something that's on my mind, but my heart all along. And I mean, I know it sounds cliche and maybe a bit hokey. I just genuinely want to help people who are grieving. I
Yeah.
want to help them understand what they're going through. And I hope it does in
Yeah.
some little way.
Yeah, oh, it is. It is for sure,
Hope
and
so.
I really love what you said about being tiring. We've
Yeah,
done hundreds of shows, and no one's really mentioned how grieving is tiring, and
it's
that's a very
exhausting.
it is. It is a very true statement,
Mhm,
and whenever everyone can attest to this, when you're tired, sometimes you're grumpy, sometimes you're
mhm,
down, you don't have energy.
mhm,
So I think that goes to say it's
mhm,
important while grieving to make sure you're getting your rest and make
mhm,
sure you're taking
mhm,
care of yourself.
mhm, mhm.
Um, I have one more question. I know Taj always has some questions too.
Sure.
I'm curious to know. We started the foundation. Taj had the initiative to start it in 2015.
Yeah, it's
My
amazing what you're doing.
Thank you, thank you.
Mhm,
Um, what I've noticed in doing our podcast and doing all the programs we do, it's helped us in our grieving process. And I'm curious to know, has starting the grieving room, has that done anything for you personally, for your own personal grieving process?
mhm. I think my sister died in 2013, and I think that the first couple years after that, I was quite passionate then as well about talking about grief and sharing grief. And sometimes I think I would think, oh, I'm putting this off. I could share more. I think the timing was good in terms of that bit, some distance from sort of that initial rawness of grief for me. So I am on the other side, I would say, of the rawness, but yet at the same time, um, the ability to just kind of name the things and just go right back into that space. You put a post up, you tell a story, you talk about it, and you remember. Your heart remembers so much what it was like in that time. Or you see someone comment, and you remember what they're going through. And then sometimes you're just right back there. You're right in you're living it again. It could have been yesterday.
Mm,
And so the beautiful thing for me about this page is, on one hand, I feel so honored that this could be a bit of a redemptive story. I'd still rather my sister be alive,
mm,
but I am glad that, and I know she would have been glad that at least there's some help that can come from what I've learned.
mm,
And I'm glad that it lets me still make space for the reality that you never really stop being a grieving person when you carry such a big loss with
mm,
you. And so you enter this world with people that get it, which is really nice, right? And they
yeah,
get it and they understand it. And they understand what it's like to be this person that walks around with just a little piece of your heart that isn't there anymore. And
yeah.
so that's been meaningful for me.
Now, you have a forthcoming book entitled Grieving Room, which
Hmm.
is set to release in 2024.
Hmm.
I'm curious to know what was the inspiration behind writing your book, and who would you say is the audience for the book?
It's the same thing. It's Griever. So as I said, after my sister died, there were so many. I do lots of speaking engagements and things like that stuff through my work, and I'd always speak about grief, and I would talk about making space for grief. And I just felt I had this book in me, which is a little bit of my sister's story, but much more about me learning to grieve and the
Mm.
type of grief we need. And I kept trying to find a title about what it was I was trying to say. And I kept saying space for grief, and about what it means in our culture, in our world, and in our lives to let ourselves grieve. And one day this expression came to me, grieving room. I was like, yes, that's it. So the book title came first, and the Instagram title, I just used the same one. um, and so the book was very much the sense that there was just this story in me burning to get out, and that I was like, I have to share this. There's something in this. I would certainly, in my role, say I felt that God had laid this on me to say you have something to share, and others might feel different language there were meaningful. But for me, it was like this is the thing I'd say. So I wrote it over the pandemic. Um, it was sort of like I'm in Ontario, which is near Toronto, Canada. We had the most lockdowns in North America. We were locked down like a lot. So if anybody
Mm.
from the States, we had like 6 months of lockdown in 2021. And I was like, I'm going to lose my mind if I don't kind of find some outlet. And I was like, I think this is the time to write this book that I put off for
Great.
2 years. And so I did. And I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I didn't know how to publish a book. I didn't know how to look for it. I just knew I had to write it. And then the next step was, then it was done, and I got some help, and I got an agent, and then I got a publisher, and I sold it a couple months ago. So it's been a journey, but to me, it was very much the sense that this is something that I'm meant to share with the world. Maybe it'll be for 10 people, maybe it'll be for 2 people. I don't know. But I just keep trying to faithfully do that. And I think in some ways that's even why the page, I think, continues to grow. I'm not trying to compare myself to others. I think that all I ever try to do with that page is sincerely help. I've never really made it about building the page or getting more followers as much as it's be here if it helps you. In
Mm.
fact, if you're ready to leave this page, that's great. Like, it's so great if you feel that you're able to heal enough that you don't need this anymore. So I think when you're making space to say, which I think is very much what both of you are doing, and it's beautiful to say, we really are just here to offer what we have to offer to someone who might benefit from it.
You're doing an amazing job because what we know, Taj and I and our board members, it's not easy to get people to want to talk about or to watch or to learn about grief until it happens to them.
It's
But
true.
for you to get to 20,000 is truly remarkable. Um, I have one question. What was the biggest lesson you learned about grief while writing the book?
I don't know if when I was writing the book there were anything particular from the book as much as like an affirmation of the same lessons that I felt like I've learned over and over, which I know it sounds like I'm, just kind of harping on the same point here, which was, wow, grief just really needs room. Like,
Mm.
and looking back at my own story and looking back my own life and remembering stories of others, I tell lots of other stories in as well, and saying, yeah, we really don't heal from grief because someone says, aren't you ready to move on? Or someone says, look at the bright side. It doesn't do it. And so just remembering again and again, as I wrote the book, I would say that what I remembered even more was how incredibly dark the couple of years after my sister died were.
Mm.
And I was going back and reading old journals as I was trying to remember. And I would read these journals, 2 or 3 months after my sister died. And I would cry for newly grieving me. I would cry for grieving Leanne and what she didn't have and what she didn't know and what she didn't understand, and how much I wished I could go back and help her know what she needed to say, help her know what she had to ask for, help her know that what she was going through was normal. But of course, that was also part of the journey. So I did learn a lot about my own grief, and just became even more convicted. Even the other day, a good friend of mine's mother just passed away a week ago, which was very sudden and awful. And he is absolutely reeling quite logically. And we kind of had a moment of laughing. A few of us were visiting after the funeral. And he said, "This is so awful. And nobody talks about this. Nobody talks about grief." And I didn't say anything. And then he just kind of looked at me and he's like, "Oh yeah, I guess you really have been trying to for a long time."
Yeah.
And we laughed. But exactly when you said, until you live through it, you just kind of tune it out. And
Yeah.
I said, "That's okay. I'm glad you haven't needed it until now."
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm sad that you do now. I'm sad that you've joined this world where you're
Mhm.
suddenly saying, how am I going to talk about this? How am I going to live the rest of my life with this reality? So hopefully we can keep making that room for each other. And when people need it, then they'll see it. Then they'll reach out. They'll reach out to the people who know they get it. And maybe you've had this experience too, where um, so often, I mean, I would say every couple months. Now that my sister died when I was 35, which was very young to lose a sister. So at that time, it's young to lose a parent, it's young to lose anyone. But certainly I was
Yeah.
quite rare in having lost a sister. And people would be very, very shocked by this. They simply did not know what to say. They did not know how to process a 35-year-old whose sister had died. And that's okay. But now I'm in this era of life. Sadly, I'm in my mid 40s where more of us are losing people. More people have lost
Mhm.
parents. More people have lost siblings, grandparents. And as they've come to me, they've said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know." I bet you've had this experience as well, right? Because until we go through it, you don't know, right? And then they go, "Oh, I didn't know what you needed. I didn't understand." So I often talk about that like post grief apology. And I
Mm.
did it too, right? And I went back to a good friend of mine who I remember had a sister specifically die a couple years before me. And I remember sending her this big apology. "I'm so sorry. I haven't been here for you. I had no idea how awful it was."
Mhm.
But that's kind of how it goes, right? That's why those of us who've been on the road hopefully can help walk with the people who are new to it.
Yeah.
Taj,
Hopefully.
did you have any question? I'm gonna keep going if you don't, but I just want to make sure.
No, I'm just fascinated by
Okay.
this, and I just think I'm wanted to say in general. You said 2013, your
Mhm.
sister
Yeah,
died.
so it's been almost a decade. It's been a
Yeah,
while.
in that way, but I think it's very commendable of you to take something like that and help others with that aspect of it, because I think that's what. Not that that's. I don't believe like that's the reason we went through what we went through, but at least we're turning it into something
Yeah.
positive in that way and helping others. And
Hmm. Hmm.
grief is this club that no one wants to join, but you're happy that other people are there once you do
Hmm.
belong to it. And that's
Hmm.
the crazy thing.
Hmm. Yeah.
So 2024 for sure, right? Do we know beginning, end?
Early 2024.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
very
you
cool.
can keep your eye.
That's a big accomplishment. It's not easy to write a book, and it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a long process, but I'm happy you're doing it and
Thank you.
contributing to the
Hmm.
community,
Hmm.
because we need more content and books and pages and all that
Yeah.
good stuff
Hmm.
regarding grief and loss. So I'm very happy you're doing that. It's not
Hmm.
easy. Okay, so in addition to cultivating this amazing online community you have
It's very kind. Thank you.
through Grieving Room, the Instagram account, but also your book. You are also an ordained minister who regularly officiates funerals and supports grieving people.
Mhm.
How does it feel? I believe you're going to be the first officiate for funerals that we've ever spoken to.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, so I'm curious to know how is it doing it on a regular basis, and what kind of what's the range of emotions that you go through when you're doing this kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is with funerals, you can have a lot at one time, and then you can go a big stretch without any. So as weird as it's going to sound, I've always loved officiating funerals. Not that I
Hmm.
actually love the experience of officiating a funeral; it's not fun,
Yeah,
but I've loved the privilege and the honor of being there and celebrating someone's life.
that's great.
And so how it has certainly shaped me as I grieve is I'm really thankful for the empathy I can have for a grieving family, and also the ability to hopefully really encourage people again to give their grief room. And so culturally, one of the things that grieves me, and maybe this is more like Canadian, or certainly certain cultures more than others. Certainly, like the upper middle class echelon seems to be more and more of this aura. There's a real tendency to actually avoid funerals of late, and I'm not sure if you've seen this in your circles, but a frequent statement is to say, well, we're just not going to have a funeral, it'll be too sad.
Hmm.
Or when we sit down to, it's shocking, it's so common. And so, or when I sit down to help plan a service with someone, can we keep it really really short? We don't want people to be sad. Can you tell every, or a common thing I'll get is at the beginning, can you just start by telling everyone not to be sad or not to cry?
Yeah.
And
How do you handle that when someone?
I just tell them no. And so, but I more kindly, and this is such a great opportunity for grief education.
Yeah.
And so I talk about, I understand that you want to avoid this so much. You don't want people to be feel pain, and this is so painful. But the only way to the other side of grief is through it,
Hmm.
and we go through it together. And this is actually something you need, and it's understandable for people to be sad because someone has died, and it is sad. And having no funeral, having a short funeral doesn't necessarily, I'm not, for some people that will be the right thing. For other, there might be other ways they want to celebrate. I'm not trying to paint just a blanket, make a blanket statement here. But I think the desire to avoid those rituals, which I have a chapter about in the book actually, because we think it'll be easier if we avoid them, is really a fallacy and a shame. So I'm really glad that I can help people remember that, and then hopefully in officiating funerals do that well. So often in funerals I will talk about grief, and I'll use that time. So I don't know people's faith background here, but I do know that there's a tendency among some ministers, this is not my favorite, to use a funeral as a chance to sort of get some
Yeah.
sneaky preaching in.
Yeah.
So this is a great chance to be like, you all need to think about what's going to happen when you die, and everyone just leaves kind of feeling terrible. And I don't see funerals as that opportunity. I see funerals as a chance to be hospitable and caring and loving. And so while I will speak about where I believe God's presence is, and all those things, and pray, and if people want to talk more about that, of course we will, I will usually use funerals as a chance to be like, I want to talk to you a bit about grief and what it's going to be like, and what you're going to go through, and how normal that is, and encourage you to make that space. So I hope it can be a bit of a gift to people in some ways. And I think it's so just such a blessing to be able to honor someone's life. And so there is a difference, I think, in officiating a funeral for someone you don't know and someone you do know. So I've
Mm.
officiated a lot of funerals for people I've known, and I've been in my same congregation for 17 years, so it's quite a long time. So sometimes I'm burying people that I love very, very much,
Mm.
um, and it's really sad, and I cry, and I've had to learn to make space for my own grief and the fact that I'm grieving this person that I'm now burying or officiating a funeral for. And sometimes I'm officiating a funeral for a total stranger that I've never met. And so those are really different dynamics.
Is there one that's more challenging than the other?
I think people I don't know are harder
Yeah.
because, I mean, again, you want it to be loving, and
Yeah.
so I'm always a little, I don't want to misspeak. I don't want to say something that's not true.
Yeah.
Like I remember when my grandmother died, who I loved dearly, the minister was new to our church. Lovely guy. He did a great job. And I remember at one point in the talk, and any of you who maybe you've been to church might know this. And he said, if Jean was here today, she'd say, "Don't cry. Let's just praise the Lord." And I almost laughed out loud, and I went, "No, she wouldn't. You have not met that woman. That is nothing like what she would say at all. That's just not how she talked." But he just kind of, I don't know, just ran with this statement of what and it felt weird, right? It didn't matter. It was fine. But yeah, I'm always a little nervous with a stranger of misspeaking or saying something that isn't true or authentic, which is hard. And sometimes you have very awkward moments because awkward things happen. And I've had many hilarious and sad funeral moments too. So
I was going to ask that. So by seeing other funerals and stuff like that, you kind of learned what you didn't want to do and how you wanted to be
probably,
different. Yeah. I'm listening to your approach, and it's one of those refreshing approaches, but it's also because you've seen what other people have done, and you're like, I'm not doing that.
And I'm not trying to be critical. It's
no,
just not for me.
Yeah.
But I think we do. Sorry, I just hit my computer. I think those of us who have that responsibility, whether it be from a faith perspective or not from a faith perspective, that we've been given this very sacred honor of caring for a griever. It's a very tender thing. And so we really have to put our own agendas aside. So, I can't have the agenda of, I want to look impressive, or I want my church to get bigger, or I want these people to, I don't know, I can't think what else it would be. It has to be about what these grievers need in this moment, which will be different for everybody, of course.
Now, I know you said sometimes you're doing a lot and sometimes you're not. In the time periods where you are doing a lot, does it ever get emotionally draining for you? Does it ever end, or does it ever follow you home, or how do you, what do you do to try to get through that time yourself?
Again, I don't know people's faith backgrounds, so forgive me if this language is too churchy or confusing, but my husband and I have a term. He's also an ordained minister, and we call it PMS, which is post-ministry syndrome, and it's this thing that happens. I know it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek term, but it's this thing where you've just kind of poured yourself out in this emotional thing and you've got nothing left. So generally after a funeral, I know, like, we're ordering in dinner and I used to, like, if a funeral is 1:00, like, I might have a meeting at 3 or 4. I don't do that anymore. Like, I've learned, no, the funeral is the task for the day. That's what you got. That's what you can manage that day, is the funeral. That took me a while to figure out. And so that's, even if it's someone you don't know, sometimes it's heartbreaking. You're just in the middle of such deep heartbreak. And of course, there's the reality that sometimes your grief is heavy. I mean, I've buried people that are like grandparents to us, literally, people who my kids called grandma and grandpa. And so sometimes it's just so sad, and your sadness is so great. So there's lots of times I've walked in the door and just kind of sat down and finally had my cry, right? Okay, now I'm having my cry. And then when it's for strangers, it's the weight of what they're feeling. But my role there is to be a non-anxious presence, to hopefully be a calming place, because people don't know how to do funerals, which is good, because in theory you hopefully won't have to do a lot. So they do need someone that can sort of say, here's what we're doing now, and here's what we're doing now, and it's okay, and then we'll do this, and that's normal, because you don't know. And so I hope to be that for people, but then it can be tiring, because you're just sort of carrying a lot.
I commend you, and I respect you and appreciate you. So thank you for all that work. That's something I don't think I could do. So I really want to make sure you get all that love and praise and respect for doing what you do, because you're so important.
I truly do love it. And because it's such a sacred space, and it's such a beautiful thing, but it wouldn't be for everybody.
So go, Taj. Yeah, go for it, Taj.
Yeah. Have you ever said no to someone just because it didn't feel like the right fit, or you just were too close to them, or anything like that? Or did you always have the approach of, like, I know I can be the right person for everyone in that way? I'm just curious. This is more curiosity.
It's pretty rare that I say no, simply because I don't get a lot of cold calls. So every now and then, if I get like a totally random call to the church, I've just been like, and the schedule doesn't allow.
Okay, yeah.
That would usually be the main reason. Or sometimes if it's someone really, really far away and I don't know them, I get a lot of asks to do like funerals for like family members or friends of congregants. So I've maybe said no to just a small, very, I can't even think of any, maybe, but it might be, oh, it's on a day that I'm not available
Yeah.
or something like that. But
Understandable.
someone from our congregation would always be a yes, absolutely. And 99% of the time, lots of friends ask me to do their loved ones' funerals, and I just consider that such an honor.
Okay.
Again, I mean, what a beautiful thing, when someone calls you and says, "Would you do my mother's funeral?" I mean, oh my goodness, like what a
Yeah. That's the
what a
ultimate
what
sign
a
of
what an
respect.
honor.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
So, Leanne, your bio mentions, and we mentioned this earlier as well, that you believe that grief does not need to be minimized, avoided, or fixed. Instead, we need to give it room. I said we were going to come back to that, and we're coming back to it. So I'm
Mhm.
curious to know, what exactly does that mean to give your grief room?
Yeah, well, maybe I can answer that by what I think it isn't a little bit. So let me mention each of those three, and what our tendency sometimes is. And I want to say again, please don't hear me being critical, because I notice sometimes people want to support grievers. Sometimes when I put posts up and I say, don't do this or don't do that, or maybe try something else, to say, what are we supposed to do? And I'll say, this isn't an insult to you. We're all trying to learn here. I usually don't say that. But, you just, we almost get taken aback, like, but now we're stuck, right? We're stuck. And so there's a few things that we think we need to do. So first of all, we often think we need to fix people's grief and make them feel better. So, we're at a funeral home or after the funeral and we see someone who's just lost a loved one. And our assumption is they need to feel better, right? Like there's something that we have to say that will improve what they're going through. And so what I mean by avoided, minimized, or fixed, that's where the minimize it or the fix come in. So the minimize can look like sort of that, well, at least they were really old. At least they had a long life. At least you got to say goodbye to them. I actually just did a post about this. And so we're kind of trying to say, or we have the sense of like, well, are you ready to move on yet? Like there's the sense that we're helping them by making it smaller. It doesn't help. It invalidates. It makes it feel like there's not space for it. And then so we want to fix it, right? So we want to say, oh, let's all go get drunk, or let's think of something happy, or let me tell you a joke, or let me do this, let me say this, let me remind you that they're in heaven, because then you'll feel better because they're in heaven. And so we want to fix it. And then often we think we want to avoid it. And so those of us who are going through grief, we think to go through grief is just so painful and so hard. So we avoid it. Right. So we're just going to ignore it. We're going to ignore it. We're just going to say, well, I won't feel those feelings. I'll do those things. And we often think that we have to do that for others. And so avoiding grief looks like we see someone who's lost someone and we don't bring it up, because we say, well, if we bring it up, we'll make them sad, which of course they're thinking about it all the time and they're already sad. So there's no, you don't remind them. So we don't bring it up. We don't talk about it because we try to avoid it. And so grieving room looks like not doing those things in some ways, right? Like it looks like acknowledging grief. So grieving room for sometimes just looks like saying, I'm so sorry that your mother died, when everyone else isn't talking about it. It looks like saying the person's name when everyone else doesn't want to talk about it. And you say, remember that time she did this? And every griever will say, oh, I love it when people do that, right? And it doesn't matter if they cry or they get teary. If someone gets overwhelmed, that can be tough. But the reality is a lot of people will say, thank you. And I remember trying so hard, thinking I had to fix it. And I remember one time there was a woman, actually it was a woman who attended our church, and her grandson died of cancer when he was 3, which is garbage. Like there's no making that better. That's terrible. So her daughter and grandson had lived in a different part of they lived in the States actually. So I hadn't seen her daughter since her son had died. And they were at our church, and she came, and of course this is very raw. Her 3-year-old had died. And so there's a children's section in our building, and there was a picture of Curious George. And I knew that her son loved Curious George. She was maintaining a blog about her son, and she got teary, and she said, oh, Carter loved Curious George. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I should have taken, this was before my sister died. Oh, I'm so sorry. I should have taken that poster down. That was my response, right? I'm sorry I left the Curious George poster up because it made you cry. And she said, oh, I love things that remind me about Carter. I'm so glad the poster is there.
Yeah.
Right. And so she didn't need me to move the poster. She just needed room to cry and remember that her son loved
Sweet.
Curious George.
Yeah.
And I just needed to make space for that. Tell me why tell me about how much he loved him. Oh yeah, that's so true. He loved him. That's great. Curious George is so funny. And so so we have to give room to others. And the really challenging thing, if I may say, is we have to give room to ourselves. That's actually the harder journey for a lot of us. It was a hard journey for me because I just didn't know how to do it. And I'm not sure if I went back, I'd know how to do it any better because it is a steep learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of it was realizing my grief needs room because there's just stuff I can't do right now. I need to say no to things. It takes up time in my schedule, my head, my life, my emotions. I'm angrier about things. I'm more irritable about things.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just crying all the time. I need to be able to talk about it. I need to let things be messy and complicated. And so Grieving Room to me looks like all of those things.
It's great. That's great. And I'm just skimming through some of the comments.
Yeah.
They're all
I haven't
agreeing.
sorry, anyone. I have not been able to read the comments.
That's usually my job, but you're talking and on a roll, and I don't want to interrupt.
glad.
But they're really appreciative of all what you're saying. So thank you for contributing to our community. And it's really cool. And I guess this will be directed to everyone out there. I see some supportive and conversations amongst each other, and that is so cool for us to see that our
I'm seeing a few
community has.
comments now.
It's wonderful.
And I would add that again, everything I'm saying, even on my page, I do tend to make generalizations, and there'll always be an exception. And so there's always those pieces of the puzzle that you're going to hear something that someone's going to say about grief. You're going to say, that's not true of me at all. I loved it when people distracted me, or I loved it when people reminded me that at least these things. So make space for what is valid for you and what you found comforting and meaningful.
Got it.
It's great.
But remember that sometimes, like I see someone coming there, and I totally hear you, Angie. You don't want to assume that they want to feel better. So there's that state of like, it's okay to make someone feel better. But a lot of times grievers don't want to feel better. They just want to get through what they're getting through. And they actually are just sitting in that place of pain. And so it's a fine line. And one of the things, and it's tricky, right? Like it's tricky. We're trying to do our best. So we're going to screw it up. I screw it up all the time still. And so, sometimes you got to course correct what you'd say to one person that they really liked. Another person found it tricky. So you just, oops, and you go a different way. Right. And being willing to say, oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't helpful. I wasn't trying to be unhelpful, and follow the griever's lead. And one of the comments that a writer who wrote a book called The Etiquette of Illness said, which is absolutely fantastic. She loves the question, would you like me to ask how you're doing? I love that question because what happens is sometimes we say, how are you doing? People aren't really sure how to answer that. They maybe feel put on the spot. If we don't ask how they're doing, it can seem a little insensitive. So this is a great experiment if you know someone hurting, not just grieving, if they're sick or whatever the case may be. When you see them, to say, would you like me to ask how you're doing? It's actually quite a life-changing question, because what you'll find is the people who don't want to talk about it will say, I'm okay, but thanks for asking. So you've acknowledged it. And then the people who want to talk about it will, and they'll say, oh yeah, it's been an awful week. So you kind of give people permission to not have to go deep if they don't want to. So I give, I want to say her name is Susan Halpern, or I should have looked this up. I apologize.
What is the name of the book?
Illness.
The Etiquette of Illness. Okay.
Yes. And I found that question really, really useful for me as someone if I'm talking to people of faith, or even not, as a person of faith myself, I will often say, instead of how are you, I might say, is there some way I can be praying for you? Because that's a nice specific question. And that can be an easier thing to answer than how I am, or, what's terrible or what's not good. So those are some tips if you're not sure where to start. And I think when in doubt, even though some people won't like this either, simply saying, I heard you lost someone. I don't know what to say. I'm so sad you lost them. I'm really sad to hear that, is, if that's true, is all most people know. They don't expect you to have something perfect to say.
Mm.
You know?
That's such a good way to close it. Is they don't expect you to have something good to say. I just think, one thing we've learned is just your presence and being there goes a long way. And I
Mhm.
love the simple questions that you are presenting that gives the person the chance and the opportunity to take it wherever they want. I think that's super important.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I have one or two more questions for you, Leanne. I'm curious to know, you have so much going on. You have your community, you have a book for the Grieving Room, the community's Grieving Room as well. What is next for you and the Grieving Room brand?
It's interesting. A few people have asked me that lately, and I'm not sure. I say, I just feel led to just continue to update and try to stay engaged, and be faithful to that. And so to me, I want to just continue to share and be open and hopefully be relevant. I'm finishing a certificate in death and bereavement. I just have one course left in that. And so I'm continuing to try and be sure that I'm keeping those skills and awareness up, my education in that area.
Great.
I do look forward to, certainly when the book comes out, traveling and sharing about it and making space to do more speaking and things like that about grief, which I already do a fair bit in Southern Ontario. Again, I'm in Canada. Where are you guys? I think you're.
California.
Well, we're based in California.
Yeah. So yeah, you're the
yeah.
Pacific. So I'm a ways away from you.
Yeah.
So there's just still so much space, and I think there's so much need. And I think sometimes I forget. I get so used to living in the grief space, which I spend so much of my time in, that it's not until, like, again, my friend's mother dies, that I realize, oh, like, this is still so new for so many people. And
Mm.
so it's not a message that will ever stop being relevant, because sadly, someone else is going to lose someone. Everyone's
right.
going to join this world
That's right.
eventually, which is really hard.
Hmm.
But at least we can try to do our best for each other as we're doing that.
So my life, my hurdles, and my survival has a super chat.
Mhm.
And Bami
Yes.
wants to know, she says, "Hey, I love what you're doing. Wanted to know if the book covers what to do when you're forced to confront the grief you've avoided. You have a friendly school teacher aura, which I love. Sending love."
Oh,
Do you
that's,
ever get that, by the way?
you know what? That's hilarious, because maybe other times, but I will tell you that in all my time doing Grieving Room, which is a year, I've only had one nasty troll, which is pretty impressive
That's great.
online.
That's great.
And at first, I wasn't sure if she was a troll. I'm still not entirely sure if she was a troll. But she just kind of was like, "Oh, everything you say is trite, and you're not helping anyone." And I wanted to make sure it wasn't a griever who was just hurting, so I engaged the conversation a little bit. And then at one point, she did say something like, "Your kindergarten teacher bullshit is getting real old," or something.
Wow.
And so she thought it too, but she didn't like it. But I'm glad. So I don't know. I'm just me. I'm sorry. That's the vibe you're getting. Just doing my thing here. But in terms of what the book, hopefully that made you smile. But in terms of what the book covers, a little bit for sure, because I talk about complicated grief. I talk about. I try to keep the book pretty. There's not a specific section on that topic, but the book tries to very broadly speak to all the grief we might have. So it's not just for people who've necessarily just had someone die recently, or even someone who's. It's not, in my opinion, I don't think it speaks just to grief from death. We grieve other things as well, which I'm sure you probably covered on this podcast. It's certainly, there's lots of acknowledgement. You may have had death. You may have had a grief that's been a long time ago. Now's the first time you're addressing it. Now's the first time it's coming up. So there's lots of those themes throughout the book. Hopefully you'll find that it does speak to some of what you're saying.
That's great.
Yeah.
So
And it's hard though, because sometimes we do actually put our grief off for a long time,
yeah.
or there's
That's-
circumstances, or we just don't realize that we were grieving
Yeah. Yeah.
until later, right?
Leanne, this is we said it would be about 30-35 minutes,
Yeah.
and we are far past that.
I'm
So
sorry.
no, so
talk.
it's my apologies for taking your time. But I want to thank you on behalf of my brother and our foundation for lending your knowledge and words to our community. We are excited to read the book. Everyone is called Grieving Room. But you don't have to wait for 2024 to get the book. You can go to
No, don't worry about
Instagram
that.
and
Yes.
go to @grieving.room and become more
Yeah.
more than the 20,000 she already has, which is
Oh,
unreal
that's
a-
kind.
and
Yeah,
amazing.
and Grieving Room is designed to be bite size so that a griever who's overwhelmed by a lot, which is why Instagram is a good platform for
Yeah.
it.
Mhm.
And this is so great too. But for that, you're like, a book is a lot to read because my brain can't read, which happens when you're grieving, by the way. But maybe this little post will just give me something to chew on. That's
Love
what
it.
it's there, to give you a tidbit that might give you some insight or encourage you.
Love it. Well done. Okay, so we said we like to close our shows. I gave you a warning before we started.
You did.
You can take this minute, 2 minute, whatever you want to do, wherever you want to go. You could talk about your favorite food recipe,
Mhm.
your favorite movie, your favorite book, your favorite quote, yeah, what you've learned this year, what you've learned doing what you're
Sure.
doing, about your book, anything you want, Leanne.
Brave, brave.
Leave our community with whatever you want to leave them with.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm gonna just be true to what I always want to say because I'm assuming a lot of people here are grieving. And so what I would want to say to any of you who are grieving and you are just feeling like there is something wrong with me. Such a common phrase from grievers, I feel like I'm going crazy. I must be doing this wrong. This can't possibly be normal. And it's true that sometimes grief can get to a place of extremeness that may need that extra help. I love that at the beginning that you acknowledge that. But honestly, to find grief exhausting and overwhelming, for it to take years, for you to feel totally alone, for you to feel like nobody gets it, for you to feel like this is just more than anyone could possibly live through, all of that is part of grieving. And you're not crazy and you're not bad and you're not wrong. You're grieving. You're grieving. And give your grief room. Let it be. Let it out when it needs to get out. Find places you can share it. Do the things that help you let your grief breathe and rage and be all the things it needs to be.
I love that. And again, Taj, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first time I've really heard letting grief or giving grief room, and I love that.
Mm.
And by the way, that was the very first time when I heard your Canadian accent.
Oh,
Taj,
Oh,
really?
I heard it in the first the
I love
process instead of
I,
process. That
I
was
love it.
the kicker for me.
Oh, well, there you go.
I
Fun.
love it. Well, Leanne, you are unreal, amazing, a
Oh, thank
beautiful
you. That's so kind. I'm honored
contribution
to be
to our
here.
world. So thank you
Yes.
so much
Mhm,
for all you're doing. Thank you for joining us this
mhm.
episode of The Power of Love. To everyone out there, we want to send you love. We hope you learned something on today's show. And we will be back next Wednesday with a new Power of Love episode
Yeah,
at 1 o'clock on Wednesday.
it's great what
Uh,
you're doing. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much, Leanne. Thank you. We
Keep in the
enjoy
good.
it, and it's been really fulfilling and helpful for not only everyone out there but for ourselves. So
Yeah.
we enjoy
Awesome.
it.
Thank you so
Well,
much. It's a
all
pleasure being
right.
here.
That is it. We'll wrap up, and we will see you guys next Wednesday at 1 o'clock. Adios, everyone.